Good afternoon. Welcome back to our session here, our first after lunch session. Thank you all for staying with us. Welcome for those of you who are joining us online from overseas. I am Jeff Lightfoot. I'm the Director of Programs for Europe at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. We're very proud and pleased to be affiliated with this event today. I'm based in Bratislava, Slovakia, and it's great to be back here in Sofia for the second time in 2 weeks for a really distinguished and extremely timely, maybe you don't even know how timely this panel is, discussion on strategic corruption, the nexus of economic security. We'll also be talking a little bit about sanctions avoidance, sanctions compliance, and that nexus between all of these issues and the oil and gas sector here and the dependency on Russia and how that abets strategic corruption in this country. It is really an honor to be here. If you have not followed the topic of strategic corruption, I would refer you back to a Foreign Affairs article from 2020 that Phil Zelikow and some others wrote that distinguishes it a little bit from standard corruption, and I don't mean to diminish standard corruption at all, which we heard about all morning, and Laura Kövesi pointed out how human of a cost it can have. But strategic corruption is defined as something a little bit different, with this nexus to authoritarian influence and the degree to which authoritarian regimes use corruption, strategic corruption, and play on those governance gaps, those rule of law weaknesses in states to advance the interests of authoritarian regimes and to undermine democratic resilience. So it's something a little bit different, something a little bit complex that we'll want to discuss and talk about in the topic of this panel, and it's of course extremely timely. So the Biden administration has made countering strategic corruption a key priority, releasing a strategy to this effect in 2021 after that article was published. And of course, it's only become that much more important after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is a very timely topic, and it's interwoven with another very timely topic, which is that of economic security. This is very much on the minds of policymakers today, not only in the context of Russian economic influence, but also Chinese economic influence and how foreign investment can be a tool of authoritarian regimes to undermine public order and national security. This is work we've been very proud to partner with CSD on here in Bulgaria, IDSCS on in North Macedonia, because economic security measures can be a very good thing, but in a weak rule of law environment, they could be also a bad thing, because anytime the government gets involved in economic instruments and is moving into the investment space or subsidies or things of that nature, then these tools can be somewhat risky. And so this is where we've been working in this region, looking at that intersection between corruption, weak rule of law environments, and economic security instruments as they move from G7 economies to Central and Southeast Europe. So these are just some kind of opening reflections to frame the conversation here that will follow. We have a really fantastic panel, set of panelists who will all kick off with some 10 minutes or so of opening reflections in their presentations, beginning with Martin Vladimirov. And then we've got a couple of excellent people, I think, teed up to offer some quick first responses to those conversations. And then this is really meant to be an interactive discussion. So we've got an hour and a half here. Half the time should really be in conversation. So I do hope that you will be active and involved. I know we've got, that means not just those of you sitting in the room here in Sofia, but those of you who are joining us online. Thank you for being with us. You can put those questions into the chat, and I believe Christina here is going to be managing that and feeding questions to me when they come in online. And those of you who want to participate here in the room, you can flag me, and we'll be sure to get you in front of a microphone. So without further ado, let me just introduce our panelists. Our first discussant will be Martin Vladimirov. You all know Martin, of course. He is the director of the Energy and Climate Program at CSD. He is a prolific author on Russian strategic corruption through the energy sector in Bulgaria, among other topics. He has worked on the field of energy security in Europe for the last few years and has significantly contributed to understanding the geopolitical dimensions of energy and financial markets. I don't want to spoil the lead, but Martin and this whole panel here has been up to some very interesting work that I'll let Martin talk to you all about. Borja Pastor, to my right, is the head of the financial crime team at the European Financial and Crime Center at Europol. His work has significantly contributed to the fight against organized crime and financial crime, promoting effective strategies to dismantle criminal organizations. Isaac Levy, at the far end of the panel, is the team lead and coordinator at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. And he specializes in energy analysis and policy. His work has significantly contributed to an understanding of Russia's fossil fuel flows and the application of sanctions. And Christopher Lambin is a senior data investigations advisor at Global Witness with a focus on data analytics, investigative research, and disinformation analysis. His work has significantly contributed to the field of data investigations and the fight against disinformation. So Martin, you've written quite a bit recently about the nexus of strategic corruption in Bulgaria and this country's continuing dependence on Russian oil in particular, and how that has a negative impact on economic security and governance in this country, with a particular focus on the Lukoil refinery. So you've got an issue brief you've put out with CSD to this effect, calling for an end to the derogation, among other things, and some other news you can share with us just now. So maybe you can talk to us in the terms of strategic corruption and sanctions avoidance. Why have the oil sanctions not worked effectively so far? How can Bulgaria strengthen its implementation and enforcement? And particularly as it relates to Lukoil, why is a derogation, in other words, an exemption from a ban on Russian oil? Why is that not needed, despite what others in the government might say? And how has it been used as a loophole to enrich the Kremlin and finance its war in Ukraine?
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure and honor to be part of this panel and also cooperate with SAIP for all these years on tackling, I think, malign authoritarian influence, on understanding the mechanisms of corrosive capital in Europe and strengthening the resilience of Europe and the world to these malign forces. I'll start by providing a general overview of what we see as economic security risks related to sanctions evasion, and how can we close these gaps, not only in Bulgaria, which is a case study, probably number one of this process, but also generally in Europe. So the Russian invasion in Ukraine was a rude wake-up call for Europe to start a process of strategic decoupling from its excessive dependence on Russian economic influence, of course, primarily the dependence on the imports of fossil fuels. And Europe has gone a long way since February 2022 in diminishing significantly the imports of both crude oil, coal, and natural gas. But there are still major loopholes in the current sanctions regime against Russian fossil fuels, which Russia has been taking advantage of successfully. And as we have noted in all of our Kremlin playbook reports over the years, it's usually about us. It's about taking advantage of governance deficits, institutional problems, state capture, leveraging informal networks of influence in order to preserve the status quo for as long as possible. In the case of Bulgaria, this has meant $3 billion in surplus profits for the largest company in the country, which is Lukoil, the Russian oil giant, and 4% of the total Russian oil budget revenues. But before zooming in on Lukoil and the case of the refinery, I wanted to point out three major pillars of sanctions loopholes that we have been discussing. First, of course, the derogation that was provided to Central European landlocked countries and Bulgaria is not justified by technical or economic analysis. All these four countries that have been put into the exemption list can physically buy alternative crude oil, so they don't need to depend on Russian crude oil imports. Bulgaria can import that via sea. It's the only country with access to the sea, actually, that has received derogation. And the three landlocked countries, Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia, can bring alternative crude oil via the Adriatic, via a special pipeline from Croatia, or from the North Sea and Germany. And these countries have lobbied heavily to receive the derogation. And unfortunately, this has become a glaring loophole, basically a backdoor for Russian continued exports of not only crude oil, but also refined products into the EU and across the world. The second major element of this sanctions evasion strategy, or undermining the sanctions list, is the oil price cap, which has been breached by Russian companies. Russian oil has been trading above $60 consistently on global oil markets. And one of the reasons why this is happening is that there are a bunch of intermediaries, both outside of the EU, but unfortunately within EU member states, that have helped Russia move crude oil and oil products all across the world. Most notoriously, I would say, Greek shippers, which control, and of course our colleagues from Korea and Global Witness, with whom we have been working for the past month on this investigation that I'm going to present, they pointing out to 30 to 40% Greek shipping of crude oil around the world. So these companies have taken advantage of the oil price cap situation, but have inflated the costs of shipping and the cost of insurance. So the final price of Russian crude oil is much higher when it arrives in India, China, or elsewhere, which has provided additional revenues to the Kremlin. We believe that the oil price cap should be lowered to $40 per barrel, because that's where Russia balances its budget. That's the fiscal rule of Russia. So it would, at the same time, reduce significantly oil budget revenues, and at the same time would incentivize Russia to keep on selling on the world market, which is the goal in the end of the day, to keep the supply high so that prices don't skyrocket. And thirdly, it's the work of all of these enablers here in Europe that have been helping Russia evade sanctions more directly, in the more criminal way that we are more used to seeing with the Iranian sanctions or the Venezuelan sanctions before, which is, for example, shipping companies employing ship-to-ship transfers to move and obfuscate basically the origin of the crude oil, the origin of the final products, so that they are not associated with Russian companies. Once the refined products are moved to another ship, they basically disappear from the radar of authorities because they are mixed with other refined products. This is the more legal way, and there is the illegal way, the illicit way, when ships actually switch off their transponders and they do illegal ship-to-ship transfers. Port authorities, customs agencies across Europe and across the world have not done good enough job in countering these practices. So we are suggesting in this policy brief that we published today a series of technical recommendations for shipping companies, for insurance companies, for port authorities on how to monitor and provide adequate due diligence for shipping operations linked to Russian oil. And now zooming in on the investigation very briefly, because both Chris and Isaac are going to talk in a fascinating way about the details of the investigation, how we got to the conclusions. I mean, they have all the data, so I'm really honored to be working with them. This has been a very impactful investigation. It basically shows that Lukoil has been able to take advantage of the derogation to continue exporting refined products in 2023 all around the world, but more notoriously even in the EU and in the US, and has generated around $1 billion additional profit for the Kremlin budget, which is really a significant part of the overall revenue that Russia receives, and is financing the war effort in Ukraine. Thank you so much, and I didn't want to go overboard, but I know that Isaac is going to talk about natural gas, a personal favorite issue, and I think natural gas is the next low-hanging fruit for the sanction regime. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Martin. That's a excellent kind of overview and framing of the issue that I know Isaac and Christopher will pick up on later. I think, because I want to come back to this in the question of, well, who's got to do their homework? Because I think you highlighted several things. One is about the derogation and the work that has to be done with a country I now call home, Slovakia. The Czechs have done a real nice job on natural gas, as I understand it. And then the Hungarians, who I'm not sure are really serious about this at all. And then on the Bulgarian side, some homework to be done there. The oil price caps, I want to get into what this discussion needs to look like going forward, and work of the enablers. I think this is, since SIPE is focused on the private sector, this is an area that I also think will be interesting to drill down into in terms of best practices from the private sector in helping not circumventing these kinds of sanctions. But let's pivot a little bit to your world, Borja, in the world of Europol, and what is the role that Europol, can you help us understand how you're involved in helping combat strategic corruption, corruption generally, illicit financial flows, what that looks like? And I recognize there's a sanctions conversation going on, but this is a little bit different than your specific mandate, but perhaps you can help us understand how Europol and your work contributes to that. Thank you.
So, yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Center for the Study of Democracy, for having me here. It's a pleasure for me. My presentation, I will try to explain you in 10 minutes, or around 10 minutes, what we're doing in terms of fighting corruption. I like this video. This video is the result of an operation that we support in Spain, Operation Aela Jumita with Guardia Civil. And for me, it's impressive the amount of money, the cash that you can see on the screen. So this is 16.5 million euros in cash. This is the biggest single cash seizure in EU, at least according to the Europol records. And this money was only to pay bribes, so to pay the corruption. This investigation was focused on the port of Algeciras in the south of Spain, and everybody working in the port was victim, let's say, of corruption activities. So everybody working in the port, custom officers, also private actors as the ones who are in charge to move the containers from one side to the other, were part of the scheme, of the corruption scheme. Just to give you an idea, so the brain of this network was named like, for the criminals, of course, was named like a Messi, the popular football player, because he was always in the middle and the one who was with the control of the match. So this is Operation Aela Jumita. And during the morning, we have had some presentations regarding how much costs corruption in the EU. There are different studies, there are different figures. I think that it's very difficult to provide a figure on this because when we are talking about criminality, it's very difficult to provide figures that we estimate. No? But I recommend you those two studies carried out by the European Parliament, and this is the figure. So 904 billion euros every single year. Of course, this amount of money is including not only the direct cost of the corruption, but also the indirect cost has taxes or all the money around the corruption schemes. With this money, we could have almost 2,000 euros per year and per person living in Europe in 2016. And with this money also we could end world hunger, because that is more than 200 billion, as you can see on the screen, provide basic education to all children in 46 low and middle income countries, that is 22 billion, help eliminate malaria, that is 4 billion, provide universal safe water and sanitation, that is 100 billion, spend healthcare to gradually provide universal care to all in low and middle income countries, that is around 100 billion, made the necessary yearly investment required to give everyone access to electricity by 2030. This is 45 billion, and at the end, 360 billion left. So this is the level of corruption. So that means that we have a lot to do. In a global level, we have a 2 trillion problem. So this is the estimation that we have. And again, this is not only a EU problem, it's a global problem. And this is the reason why we need to harmonize anti-corruption policies and anti-corruption strategies, not only in the EU, but also in the world. In 2021, Europol released the Serious Organized Crime Threat Assessment, SOCTA. Those are some of the more relevant findings within the report. Just to give you an idea about what is organized crime, the 3 pillars for organized crime, or the three pillars who are making possible that criminal organizations could operate in EU is violence, money laundering, and corruption. And 60% of the organized crime are using corruption to make possible that the criminal activities that they are involved could be a reality. And also the most recent study, also named this morning by the colleague from DG Home, is the FECTA, the European Financial and Economic Crime Center threat assessment, is focused on our criminal business, our criminal areas. So this is also key findings. So corruption, money laundering, and criminal finance are key to sustain, to maintain organized crime in EU, but of course, I have to say that it's not only in EU, it's in a global issue. This report mentioned that the 98% of the criminal assets are not seized. So that means that only 2% of the criminal assets are seized in EU. That means that this other 98% is fuel for corruption. So this is the money that criminal organizations has to be able to pay bribes and to carry out corruption activities. So it's a lot of money. Commissioner Johansson, with the publishing of this report, mentioned the relevance of these findings, of these key elements in organized crime, and I think that, again, we have a lot to do in these regards. And now, let's move on to a more specific, or the specific role that Europol has within the European Financial and Economic Crime Center. In Europol, we have an analysis project, a team in charge to support investigation on corruption. This is the AP corruption, analysis project corruption. Through the information, through the data that we have from the investigations that you are carrying out in your countries, those are the main, let's say, the main issues or the main topics that we are supporting. So grand corruption cases, of course, in numbers, is not the most relevant in numbers of cases, but in number of money, amount of money, is the most relevant. Bribery in international trade also is one of the most often kind of cases that we have, and corruption cases involving law enforcement and judicial authorities. Of course, there are other forms of corruption, such, for instance, corruption in sport, that also is within the portfolio of AP corruption. The specific support that we are providing to the member state and also to non-EU member states who are part of our operational partners is basically what you can see on the screen. So when we receive information from the member states, from the operational partners, we analyze that information. This information become a part of the Europol database, and then is when I started the intelligence process with that information. We carry out cross-match reports with entities that you can share with us. We also carry out and draft operational analysis reports from the member states. Of course, we enrich those reports with OSINT information, and when we identify a risky trend, a new trend, we also disseminate between the member states early warning notifications. Of course, we are part of the strategic reports, as the one that I mentioned at the beginning, so the SOCTA and the FECTA, providing our inputs coming from the investigations that you are conducting in your countries. Also, you can see on the screen two small picture of EncroChat and SkyCC for the ones who are familiar with this, for the ones who are involved in law enforcement investigations. Those are two encrypted platforms of telecommunications that we were able to intercept, and because of that, now we have a very, let's say, a very big picture and very precise picture on how the criminality is working, and overall, in this case, how corruption is involved, or how corruption is linked to the most relevant OCEs, or organized criminal groups. Of course, we are providing operational support on the spot, basically to the colleagues, to the investigators who request our support. We organize operational meetings. we are able to deploy in the spot to support the extraction of data from devices, from computers, to later carry out with the analysis of that data. And we also have infrastructure to establish a Europol coordination center what is needed. Apart of that, other support that we are providing in relation to corruption is providing our expertise in several networks, as the one led by the Commission, the EU Home, the EU Network Against Corruption, but also we are part and leading operational actions within the MPAC, and also providing our expertise in other forums, in other networks in relation to corruption. This is an important point because it's a very recent. This is within the Siena, that is the only channel that Europol has to exchange information, operational data, with the member states, with the investigators. So Siena is the only platform. It's a secure channel to exchange information. It's a very good channel. We have established within there a network only for anti-corruption investigations to increase the confidentiality of the information. So I have the experience, and when I was working before Europol in my country in anti-corruption investigations, that it's not easy to share information on anti-corruption cases when you have to share the name of the politician or the name of someone who is involved in corruption. So everybody knows that is not easy, no? And send this information without having, the knowledge on who will have the access to that information is not easy. So with this channel of communication, we are providing this confidentiality in order to avoid that who are not allowed, let's say, to see the information cannot do it. And within Siena, with this communication channel, not only is a way to exchange information with Europol, but also between the different anti-corruption agencies. So if there is a case, for instance, in Bulgaria, and they want to exchange information in anti-corruption case with, with Croatia, they could send that information through this channel, and only the sender and the receiver will be the ones who have access to the information. That's all. I will be very happy later if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Borja. There's some pretty staggering statistics that you highlighted about the depth of the problem, and I think it'll be interesting to dig a little bit deeper into how some of your work kind of works in practice, capacity support, things of that nature in the discussion that follows. But let me turn now to Isaac Levy to kind of pick up on perhaps where Martin had kicked us off from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, talk a little bit more about the strategic corruption here in Bulgaria and some of the story that you all have broken today in Politico.
Thanks very much for the organizers and for inviting me to this brilliant event. I've been really excited to work with both Martin, Christopher, and others on this story about Burgas specifically, but I'm going to start with a kind of introduction to our organization and then move into a kind of holistic approach to look at how Russia is able to fund the war through its fossil fuel exports. So, who are CREA and what do we do? CREA provide analysis, data, and policy recommendations on fossil fuel revenues that enable Putin to wage the war against Ukraine. We've been a key convener and insight leader in the sanctions advocacy space across NGOs and other organizations too. We're a dynamic team that aim to provide analysis ahead of the curve, such as the laundromat report that we'll be moving on to at some point in the presentation. We present advice and analysis to senior policymakers too. So as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, this is our live fossil fuel tracker that shows the euros piling up every moment that the EU enables fossil fuels to enter. So if we zoom out and have a quick look at the impact of the war on Russia's fossil fuel exports, you can see the chart on the right-hand side. The first dotted line on the left-hand side shows the invasion of Ukraine. But after that, prices spiked up, and we can see that revenues increased. The two dotted lines to the right-hand side after that show the imposition of the EU's crude oil ban and associated price cap, and the second line, the oil products. Originally, these sanctions did have a positive effect at reducing Russia's fossil fuel exports, but without proper monitoring, enforcement, and closure of the loopholes associated, which we'll touch on, Russia's been able to increase its export revenues from these fossil fuel flows. So in 2022, data showed that about half of all the Kremlin's tax revenues were received from oil and gas. It's a key enabler of their military aggression. Russia's actually more dependent than ever on earnings from oil to fuel the war. We've seen from their budget deficit rising significantly to record levels on the Russian ministry's data set, which dates back to 2011. The effect of sanctions, as we mentioned, have been originally positive, but have managed to reduce in impact as a result of a lack of enforcement and closure of those loopholes. I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about the oil price cap policy. So Russia's earned 132 billion euros exporting seaborne oil since the start of the bans imposed by the EU. And that's until recent dates. As we say, we track live shipments as well. So more than half of all this oil was transported on tankers that were either owned or insured in the EU or G7 countries. So Putin does not have enough shadow tankers to transport its oil and fully circumvent the price cap. Traders are instead evading the price cap policy by attaining fraudulent documents. In the most recent month of October, 37% of tankers were covered under the price cap for crude oil shipments and 65% for oil products. This shows the leverage that the policy does still have if the prices are lowered and the policy is monitored and enforced effectively. So why is the enforcement of the cap failing? Ural's prices have remained above the cap since July, but EU and G7 owned or insured tankers are still showing up to Russian ports and transporting Russian oil. As Martin already mentioned, 25% of all those tankers were owned in Greece. The enforcement hasn't worked in Pacific trade, such as India and China out of Russia, and this is shown by customs data we've investigated to show that the buyers have been paying significantly above the $60 per barrel level set by the oil price cap policy. The enforcement failure has enabled Russia and OPEC Plus to manipulate markets with supply cuts, and these announced supply cuts have been associated with spikes in prices. We're stating that the price cap is currently too high, as Martin mentioned, that if the oil price cap had been set for crude oil to $30 per barrel, this would have slashed Russia's export revenues by 59 billion euros, or 49%, in assuming full monitoring and enforcement of the policy. And it's also significantly above the production costs, which we're estimating at about $15 per barrel. So lowering the price cap would also be deflationary. It would reduce Russia's export prices, and therefore they would increase production quantities to attain stable revenues that we've seen. In recent months, in periods of lower prices, we've actually seen higher volumes that they've exported, showing their reliance on receiving steady revenue streams. Full enforcement at the cap currently would have cut Russia's export revenues by about 25%, or about 3.75 billion if we look at the October figures alone. Monitoring and enforcement issues. The price cap relies on these attestation documents that are issued by traders outside of enforcement agencies' jurisdictions, making the system vulnerable to falsified documents. Not enough is being done by the current enforcement powers. For example, the UK is the largest insurer of Russian oil, insuring 33% or a third of all Russian oil transported by sea since the imposition of the sanctions. The enforcement agency in the UK, OFSI, have previously reported the collection of limited attestation documents. Without scrutiny, Western companies aren't dissuaded from providing insurance or tankers to facilitate oil exported above the price cap policy. The penalties are significantly too weak, with violations being caught resulting in exclusion of insurance or services for a mere 3 months. That's just a slap on the wrist as a punishment, rather than what we suggest of a ban of in perpetuity. We suggest that banks have to be verifying the payments of oil to show that it was adhered to the price cap. This would shift the liability to banks for processing violating payments. Tankers passing through coastal states should also have to provide insurance documents to show compliance. Lots of oil we're seeing is actually being transported without insurance and therefore poses environmental threats too. Ship-to-ship transfers of Russian oil. This is a way of masking the origin of the Russian oil as being attained from another country and therefore enabling it to come in as imports into other sanction-imposing countries. We've seen an increase of 54% in ship-to-ship transfers of Russian oil. This is partially due to a change in trade routes and the logistics being more complicated, as well as many ships being reluctant to enter Russian ports. However, some of it is done to mask the origin of the oil and evade sanctions. Focal points of Russian oil transshipments have been observed in Ceuta, Spain, Constanta, Romania, or the Laconian Gulf in Greece, of which we think the sanction-imposing countries need to improve their monitoring of. The operations involving shadow tankers with no dubious insurance and safety oversight constitute a risk to the coastal waters. Ship-to-ship transfers from price cap compliant tankers to those shadow tankers should be banned, as well as the provision of services such as tugboats needed to facilitate S2S transfers of Russian oil. Instances of vessels turning off their AIS transponders to show their location have increased 225% globally in the first quarter of 2023 on the prior year. To touch on the story that we mentioned today of the Burgas refinery, Bulgaria is the fourth largest importer of seaborne Russian crude oil this year, behind India, China, and Turkey. Lukoil's Burgas refinery increased its reliance on Russian crude to 93%, up from 70% prior to the invasion. Imports of Russian crude accounted for 1.1 billion in tax revenues to the Kremlin. The Burgas refinery exported almost a billion, 984 million euros of oil products between January and October this year. At Korea, we track shipments showing, for example, the Sea Express, which delivered 40,000 tons of oil products to the Netherlands. Russian oil, therefore, ends up fueling vehicles in the EU and shows a hub within the EU borders that's importing Russian fuel and exporting the refined products to other EU countries and worldwide as well. Since the ban on Russian oil products, tankers departing the Burgas refinery have conducted a 3 times increase in ship-to-ship transfers, perhaps masking the origin of this oil. This turns me on to our next report, which is, our prior report, the laundromat, which shows those 5 identified countries that have massively increased their imports of Russian crude since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also increased the exports of refined oil products to those countries imposing sanctions listed on the right. So to take the example of India, they've increased their imports of Russian crude by 13.5 times, and also increased their exports to the EU. To touch on gas, Russian gas has seen a 44% drop in pipeline exports to the EU in 2022, as you've probably seen in the news. This has damaged Russia's gas sector in terms of production cuts and lower tax revenues. LNG shipments, however, have increased 26% to EU since the invasion, which has partially offset this decline in the pipeline gas. Russia is more reliant on EU gas market, making up 47% of sales in 2023 from 37% in 2021. Russian LNG shipments are reliant on EU ports for transshipment. This is where the LNG is stored and re-exported to other countries, some outside of the EU. Banning transshipment could make logistics of LNG exports difficult, lowering their profits and volumes as well. This is a suggestion we're proposing to the EU Commission. Russia's plans to expand gas production requires EU reduced reliance. We therefore must prevent investing in LNG infrastructure projects and investing in the extraction as well. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to pass on to Christopher, or back to Jeffrey.
Thanks very much, Isaac. And Christopher, to be our closing presenter here from Global Witness, talking, I think, a little bit about how data can help strengthen the fight against strategic corruption. So over to you, Christopher.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you to CSD for the organizers for bringing through this conference, and thank you to Isaac and Martin for working with us on this investigation about the Burgess refinery. But yes, I'll start by talking about how CSOs like Global Witness, who are an investigative NGO, can use data to expose or to investigate potential sanctions evasion and illicit supply chains, and how we can use both open source and commercially available data as part of the toolkit in the broader investigative journalism toolkit. So first of all, CSOs like Global Witness, we can be an extra set of eyes in the fight against illicit economic activities, given that half of the problem with enforcement is lack of attention, or people being able to see what's happening. So we are another body that can be doing that kind of thing, can be bringing attention to these activities that we find, bring pressure through public awareness by partnering with media and journalists. We can generate public attention and get call on officials and companies to change their activities. We can advocate for better regulation and the closing or strengthening of sanctions and closing loopholes. And in other cases, we can even flag for enforcement agencies, as we can find the issue and they can carry it on to see if there is actual crime to be proven. And doing this often is the case with economic crimes like bribery, corruption, money laundering, and so on. They are, by nature, very secretive acts. However, there is a rich universe of data that surrounds the flow of physical commodities around the world. We can track them from source to consumer, and we can see the companies that are involved. The kind of data that Global Witness uses involves the shipping and freight data, which has already been demonstrated by Isaac and Martin here, which we can use either bills of lading, cargo manifests, and AIS transponders on vessels to fully map in total scope and scale the movements of cargoes around the world of any commodities and the companies that are involved. We can, with this, reveal both regular patterns and suspicious anomalies, both of which could be further investigated. We also can access import and export customs data, again, similarly providing rich data on the array of commodities entering and leaving countries and the market players involved. We can use satellite imagery, and there's now loads of commercially available providers of satellite images. In some cases, we have even commissioned satellites to take pictures of an area that otherwise wouldn't regularly be photographed, but given the collection of providers, you can be pretty confident that every square meter of the Earth is photographed just about every day in varying degrees of resolution. And so this kind of data is decisive in verifying on-the-ground facts and crucial in tracking developments in hard-to-reach places and seeing changes in infrastructure and in the environment, and particularly seeing the movements of cargoes, such as the ship-to-ship transfers that are very easy to spot if you know where to look. And then also on top of this, we can enrich with corporate ownership data and government and contract and procurement data that expands the web and shows the structure and affiliation of the companies that are involved in the trading of these commodities. And so sourcing this data can be a very simple task. It may be openly available, may be public and managed by reputable sources, in which case we just go and look. It could be commercially available, but also provided by reputable sources. So in that case, the only barrier is cost. But in other cases, we might be dealing with leaked data. We might be dealing with data from less reputable sources, in which case we need to work on verifying and validating our data sources. There are other challenges as well, that real-time or up-to-date data may not be available. There may be a lack of standardization or comparability between data sets. And I'm sure, as you all know, that some regions have completely different recording standards, and so there may just be gaps between regions in the data sets. But overcoming these challenges allows us to combine all of these data sources together we can trace the full stories of physical commodities, and with this full picture, we can interrogate further to uncover the potential sanctions evasion that lie within these supply chains. And for CSOs like Global Witness, these insights are crucial for exposing wrongdoing. This has been the standard practice for Global Witness since its inception, in that they find corruption or sanctions evasions. They don't just start by following the money, they follow the commodities first, be that oil, timber, diamonds, or other minerals. And following those, you are able to further find where the money goes, and there the investigation begins. And so now I'm going to show a few case studies of the synergy of this data using various sources combined to expose harmful supply chains and flag cases of potential sanctions evasion. So first, I'd just like to bring attention to a couple articles that were published only in the recent weeks and one earlier this year. These all used the very simple task of acquiring import or export data that is easily available, I think in some cases less than $200 to buy these data sets of products being shipped to Russia. And all you need to do then is use the HS codes to identify the commodities or products. There are lists compiled by the sanctions and also by the European Union and Ukraine on dual-use items or high-risk items that may be used in the battlefield. With those HS codes, all you need to do is look in the data set and you will find them being sold to Russia by UK and European firms in plain sight. They just happen to be buried in these data sets, but buried only very shallowly and are easily accessible. And in some of these cases, governments have responded saying that these are effectively sanctions violations, or if they were aware, they would not have allowed them to happen, and are hoping to close these loopholes. Moving on to a investigation from Global Witness that happened last year. This, and excuse my Russian pronunciation here, this was looking at the Termako-Stavoya gas field in Siberia that was jointly owned by Total Energies at the time and Novatek. It produced gas condensate that was first processed in a facility in the north and then sent to a refinery in Omsk on the Kazakh border. And then products from that refinery, such as jet fuel, were delivered to several Russian military air bases on the border with Ukraine. And subsequently, those air bases were used to conduct bombing raids on the civilians of Ukraine. Now, Global Witness was able to acquire data that showed in very rich detail rail cargoes going from the refinery to these air bases and from the gas field to the refinery. And we're able to also confirm these deliveries by using satellite imagery to show that these cargoes have arrived at these air bases. And very clearly, using relatively available data, in this case actually the data set was taken offline by the original provider, and their colleagues at the Anti-Corruption Data Collective had to buy it from an alternative seller. But nonetheless, they were able to prove this, and afterwards Total denied any relation with the Russian military, of course, and they said they couldn't control where products from the Omsk refinery were going, but days later they announced that they were selling their share of the gas field. So this is a very clear case of using the freight data here to prove wrongdoing in supply chains. This next one is from earlier this year, also proving systematic violations of the price cap. So here we're looking at the price of ESPO, which is a grade of crude sold in the eastern port of Kozmino from Russia. We can see in this chart that at no point over the past 2 years has it gone below $60 per barrel, which is the price cap level. And we were here looking between December and January, and we saw that up to 50% of all trades of ESPO crude coming out of Kozmino involved in some way European traders, shippers, or charterers. And that amounts to around 20 million barrels of oil. In this case, all we needed to use was the shipping data provider Kepler, which, these vessels are recorded. All of the data is very systematically recorded. Often we're using it in a different way that normally would be, that Kepler is often used by commodities traders, not investigative journalists, but nonetheless, the data is right there. We also combined it with export data that shows companies that initially were based in Switzerland have consistently moved their bases of operations to Dubai, so they're no longer having to comply with the price cap. One company in particular is Paramount Energy and Commodities. You see the blue dots represent trades conducted by their Swiss entity, and orange and red dots represented by their Dubai entity. And we see that before the price cap was enforced, this company began all of its trading of price cap violating, or supposed price cap violating oil from their Dubai entity. However, just recently, actually just yesterday, the UK Foreign Office has sanctioned this entity, accusing them, and I can quote this one, of employing deceptive shipping practices as well as opaque ownership structures that have been used by Russia to soften the blow of oil-related sanctions. And in this case, again, the data was clear using export data and combining it with commodity and freight data. And the final story, the one of the hour, which we've already covered, this one, I think more than any, was a case where the data has been sitting in front of us for over a year. And I'm sure to most people in this room, it's a known fact what the story is. And we sometimes risk falling into the trap of thinking that it isn't a story at all. But when you put the facts together and you put a number to it, you still find the story to be an outrage. And I'll say the numbers again, that it's almost 4.9 million tons of crude has been purchased by this refinery to produce refined products. This is generating 1.1 billion, or an estimated 1.1 billion tax for the Kremlin for the beginning of this year. And not only this, its percentage and use of Russian crude has increased dramatically since the invasion of Ukraine, both demonstrating potentially cynical use of Russian crude and also the lack of a necessity of Russian sources in the past. And then we also have analysis that shows that, yes, almost €1 billion was made just through the seaborne, or value was just sold of seaborne refined products. And then we also see the trade to the EU, where there are shipments of refined product leaving this refinery that technically would not be considered, or potentially not considered, obtained from Russian crude, in spite of the fact that the refinery was running on entirely Russian, or almost entirely Russian crude. And so just as we see with these examples that Isaac raised with the laundromat in Turkey and India, where they are taking Russian crude and they are selling refined products that is now no longer considered Russian, we have legal reality coming into conflict with the physical reality, where Russian oil is being processed at a Russian-owned refinery, and they are being exported to sanctioning countries, because only with respect to the legal text, they are not considered Russian anymore. And it's an even greater outrage that this is happening on EU soil. So again, I do want to call this story an investigation. It's taken a great deal of time to understand the full detail of the sanctions, to gather all the data and make sure it's reliable. But this was another clear case of where CSOs like us, we have the time, the mandate, the resources to collect this data, understand it, and present the story. And as Koveshi said earlier this morning, that it's the important part is just establishing the facts in a reliable way, and proving what we know to the people that matter. And that is what using data in these investigations has allowed us to do. So thank you for your time, and welcome any questions.
Thanks very much, Christopher. So I know, Martin, you've wanted to have a quick two-finger, and then I wanted to turn to a couple folks in the audience who I think have some views on this set of presentations, particularly given that I might say you've stirred up a little bit of a hornet's nest in this country. So I think we should talk a little bit about that as well. So over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to add two things. One is another case which is very interesting and exemplifies the STS, because we are very Europe-focused right now, but this is a global problem. And one of the STS that we have investigated in this analysis involves, Russian refined products delivered to the US via a Malta-based ship-to-ship transfer and a Bahamian ship. So there are also refined products going to the US, which, first of all, of course, has a loophole on importing partially fuels, which is a problem, we think, and this needs to be closed immediately. But it provides a very clear kind of example that this can happen with any kind of jurisdiction, and no one is immune for that. And another kind of concrete recommendation we wanted to propose, looking at the EU case and Bulgaria, it's a very boring thing. It's not sexy at all. But there is a customs union regulation from 2015, which has a boring form that each custom agency needs to fill when they green light a cargo, a fuel cargo, to leave a certain port. This form can be edit, there is one paragraph needs to be added to this form. It's that boring, which says that the shipper guarantees that the fuels he or she is transporting, are not from Russian origin. Simple as that. One sentence. This could actually make the price paid by shippers moving refined products from Russia much higher. In the Politico article today, there are shippers and traders quoted anonymously saying that we thought that it's all legal, it's all fine to do it. So actually, private entities might not really understand what's going on and what's the problem.
Are you saying this would effectively make them like legally liable in the sense almost like
Exactly.
they signed some sort of
So if there is
contract?
due diligence, if there is a check, they will be more easily liable.
Sometimes the boring things are the ones that actually can really count. Contracts are pretty boring, except when they really matter, right? As a lawyer once told me. So I think we have a couple of interventions to respond to this. Mr. Dobrev, the chairman of the Energy Committee of the Bulgarian Parliament here, I wonder if you'd like to say a couple words. The microphone is coming your way.
Sure. Thank you very much. What is clear from the data that you just presented is that before the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Bulgaria was buying half of its crude oil from Russia, between 48 and 52%. And after the start of the war, we are buying more than 94% from Russia. It's even worse because the quantity not only doubled but actually tripled, since before the beginning of the war, the refinery was not working at 100% of its potential, of its capacity. So we were buying 50% or 48%, or about 15 million barrels. And after the start of the war, we are not buying double that quantity, so 30 million barrels, but we are buying 45 million barrels. So what happened was that sanctions not only did not hurt Russia, but actually helped them sell more. It's actually not the sanctions themselves, but the derogation that the Bulgarian government got for who knows what reason. I cannot find a single reason for that derogation, and we have enough reports from CSD and from many other international think tanks that prove that we don't need that derogation. The funny thing is that even the Prime Minister lately confesses that we don't need that derogation and struggles to explain why we have that derogation and why they keep protecting that derogation. The truth is that this derogation did not only fill Russia's budget with billions, as we have seen in Politico, including today, but also did not benefit the Bulgarian consumer at all. Because if you look at the price of gasoline and compare it to other countries, but price without VAT and without excise, you will see that there are 12 countries in the European Union with cheaper gasoline than Bulgaria. So Lukoil is buying cheap Russian oil, refining it, and selling it on the market in Bulgaria at very high prices, pocketing the whole difference and sending it to Russia. And then the second thing is, back 2 years ago, they were working at 60% capacity and exporting. Now they're working at 100% capacity and not exporting, supposedly. Where is this gasoline going, right? The Bulgarian market is small. We cannot consume more. We have a certain number of cars. We travel a certain mileage. Where is all of this gasoline going? And yes, you're right. They're exporting it all around the place, covering it up. They're exporting it. So I believe it's a final time to get rid of that derogation. I have proposed it personally a number of times now. Every time unsuccessful. I will do that again today and hope that I'm more successful this time. Thank you.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Sure.
So what is it for the derogation to go away? This is something, if I understand it right, the Bulgarian government at the European Council says, I got to have this. It's a must for me to approve the next package of sanctions. Look at the crystal ball for us. Help us understand if this is going to happen, what needs to happen, what's the timeline, or could this just drag out indefinitely?
Okay, this is a really good question. The derogation, the directive about the sanctions says that Bulgaria might give a derogation to Lukoil. So it is not EU legislation granting a derogation. It is EU legislation allowing Bulgaria to choose whether to grant or not. And the derogation itself was given to Lukoil with a decision of the Council of Ministers. So it is really simple. It takes less than 24 hours. They can do it today if they want. They can have a Council of Ministers meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I'm suggesting that, proposing that to the government. So let's have a 10 a.m. Council of Ministers meeting tomorrow and take a decision by the Council of Ministers to revoke that previous decision and get rid of that derogation. Because it serves Russia only and alone.
Thanks for the clarification. Really, really interesting intervention. Let me actually just ask, does anybody in the audience, because I think he's making some interesting points, we have questions for the panel, but while you've got the mic, does anybody actually have a question for him to follow up on any of this? If not, I'd like to throw it to Nikola Yankov, who I think also wanted to have a short intervention as well. Okay, Nikola.
Oh, thanks, Jeffrey, and thank you for all the panelists for wonderful presentations, highlighting the core of the issues that we're facing right now. I want to talk about the political aspect of sanctions and the fact that they, by their very existence, do not help. A sanctions package is a political decision that allows the administration to act or not to act. Some people may say it not just allows, but actually directs the administration to do something important by following and restricting in this particular case, we're talking about capital flows and goods flows to Russia, but ultimately it is really a piece of paper with lots of words on it. Now there's plenty of governments that have allowed certain aspects of business to continue. For example, the insurance of Russian cargo in the UK, the shipment of Russian cargo through Greek-owned vessels, or the processing of Russian crude in the hub in Burgas, and the re-export of Russian refined products to the EU and other places. And that all happens under the supervision of governments who supposedly should enforce sanctions. So I want to highlight that it is not just the sanctions as words that matter, it's the execution more than anything else. Now, the execution in the administration is more or less a function of political will. So if there is a direction from the government down to the national security agencies, for example, to enforce AML procedures, restricting capital flows to Russia, payments to Russia, work with Russian counterparties in the financial sector, that have a real impact on the ground. If there's no such a directive, nothing's going to happen. For example, in Bulgaria, I'm a representative of the financial sector here. I haven't really seen any change in the policy of the National Security Agency, which is tasked with AML regulations and enforcement and sanctions enforcement related to Russian capital flows. I haven't seen any change in their policies, practice on the ground, any rigorous procedures, audits, checks. Nothing has happened since the invasion in Ukraine, although we've had a few sanction packages passed by the EU in that respect. So that is a direct answer that if there's no political will and if there's no actual action on the part of the administration, sanctions don't really matter. And in fact, I would argue that sanctions may not be that much necessary because there are people like Orban in Hungary or Fico in Slovakia that would try to veto sanctions. Even some members of this government have threatened the EU with vetoes of the sanction packages to get the derogation we're talking about right now. So the political effort that is expended the political capital, the intensity of discussion, and to enforce the next sanction package, a new regulation, I think is not that much necessary. What is more necessary, however, is work on the ground, on the practical level, within the national security agencies, within the administration, in the customs agencies, in the law enforcement agencies, and in the private financial sector. And I would argue that work with the private financial sector is the ultimate goal to limit capital and commercial flows to Russia, because if the banks and other financial institutions like the insurers, who are very fragile entities, they're very risk averse, as you all know, are threatened, they feel the risk on their backs, that they can lose their license or be slapped with a designation as a violating entity, that would end them, that would nullify the value of their shareholders. That is a pretty steep price to pay as a risk-reward scenario. So they would stop immediately what they're doing if they feel that heat around the corner. The fact is that they don't feel it that much. And that is the reason why they're doing it and why we're having the discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. You've gotten to a couple points that I really wanted to unpack with this panel, which really gets to of the pretty remarkable anecdotes and data that has been put before us, begs the question of, well, why is this happening? What's really behind it, and what can we do about it? But I have some questions for the rest of this panel, but I also want to see if you all have questions you'd like to ask the panel. And Christine, I don't know, are you monitoring the online? Do we have folks chiming in? No, okay. So those of you watching at home, you've got some work to do, but we'll keep the conversation going here. Signal me if you'd like to ask a question. So let's maybe move on to the points that Nicola put before us. So there are some practical recommendations about, for example, I remember being with you, Martin, in Brussels, actually, in Ruslan. We were talking about, this is when the oil price cap was being debated, and the question was coming up from influential people in Brussels, what's the number? And you had strong views on this. Now you're saying the number is too high, the number needs to go lower. Is there a prospect of that happening? What would that need to look like? What are the coalition of actors that need to be involved in that? And actually, if the rest of these things don't happen that we've heard Nicola talk about and you all talk about, the ship-to-ship stuff continues to happen, is it the right answer? That's maybe my first question for you all to take on.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Well, actually, there is a coalition of the willing in the EU and Ukraine, so the Ukrainian government themselves, mostly countries in Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltics, primarily Poland, who are strongly pushing for lowering the cap to $30 per barrel. The Ukrainian government, I think Zelensky said it in one of his meetings, I think with Biden. So there is a lot of push for that. There is no logic to keep the price cap so high. I think that actually the price cap was designed so that Russian oil keeps on flowing, which is a little bit disappointing. And it was only a matter of time that it would have been breached. Actually, in this discussion that you're referring to, we were saying that there will be enough intermediaries, enough enablers around the world that will be breaching that. While the pushback from the EU and the US at that point was, no, I mean, this is too risky, as